All right, well, I want to introduce myself. I'm Shirley Rager. I'm an SE for Tableau. And over here we have Brendan Lee, which is part of our dev team for the Web Data Connector. And so that should kind of give you a hint. This is about the Web Data Connector. So if you don't want to hear about the Web Data Connector, you're in the wrong room. When I'm on an airplane and I'm about to take off, they say if you're not going to, I live in Dallas, this is your last chance to exit. So if you're not here for the Web Data Connector, this is your last chance to exit. I'm just joking. You can, if you need to use the bathroom, okay. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? The man after my own heart up here, Web Data Connector, yeah. So first of all, we're going to talk about what is the Web Data Connector. What does it fit within our ecosystem, right? Where do we go to get data from those Web Data Connectors? Also, I want to give you some success stories, personal success stories for customers that I've worked with in the Dallas area. And then I'm going to talk about my story where I had a question and I wanted an answer. And my friend Brendan helped me out. And then he's actually going to walk you through what he did for me, which was fantastic. Okay? So this is kind of a slide to tell you where the Web Data Connector fits within the development stack, right? There's other classes that have happened through TC that kind of talk about each one of these individually. But you can tell down here at the bottom, this is part of the Web Data Connector as part of that dev stack. So what is the Web Data Connector? Has anyone in this room wanted to pick up data from the internet? That new thing called the internet? Yes. Have we ever wanted to do sentiment analysis? Look to see what our customers were saying about us. Be able to pick up maybe Facebook information or Twitter information. Or most popular, figure out, did I step enough today with my Fitbit? That's what the web data allows me to do. If I go to these websites and I see data, historically you could just copy the data, maybe paste it into Tableau, or the infamous export option, right? We all love that, right? Because we have no idea what kind of format we're going to be exporting it to, right? And it's a one-time deal. You export it, you do your analysis, but what if you wanted to keep refreshing that data? What if that was something you wanted to share with other people within your organization? What if after every single day of a conference, you wanted to see what people were talking about? Well, then you would want to refresh this information, and that's where the Web Data Connector comes in. The Web Data Connector allows me to make that connection and then refresh that information into the extract, publish that up to Tableau server, and then share and collaborate that with others, which is very important when you're dealing with web services. So where does it fit within the ecosystem? Some of you guys may have this little elephant here in your organization, right, the little Hadoops. Some of you may be closet Excel users. It's okay. You're with family and friends. You can admit we're all good, right? Or you may have that great ETL database that your IT has provided for you that's fast and efficient. But what about the other data sources I may want to get to? Like my Twitters, or my cloud APIs, or even our great REST API. That's where the Web Data Connector comes into play. It gives me the ability to kind of make that look like a database that I can connect to and refresh and share. So I want to start with a story, and this is a personal story to me. We have a great company in Dallas called BNSF. It's actually called Burlington North Santa Fe, right? Northern Santa Fe. And they are the largest railway transportation company in North America, in all of America, right? One of the great things, they have 32,500 miles of railway. If you walk that, you're done for the week for a Fitbit, just saying, right? Easy work out there. They're also a very large Tableau customer. They're using Tableau in 30 different divisions within BNSF. And they had a question about survey data. This is internal survey data for them. And as historically, they would have to export this, go into Excel, do all these other things. It was a nightmare. They spent 60% of their time data wrangling and only 40% of their time actually analyzing the data that they needed. And so they used a custom Web Data Connector to connect into their own web service within their own internal company to understand what their survey data was telling them. And then publish that up to Tableau server, and this gets refreshed on a scheduled basis. But what about Tableau, right? Web Data Connector is a Tableau thing, right? Has anyone seen the Tableau on Tableau presentation? It's pretty awesome. Tableau uses Tableau for everything we do. I manage a team of pre-sales engineers for Tableau. I look at Tableau dashboards every day. It helps me understand what they're working on, where their challenges are. And one of the things that is very important to us is to know what our customer challenges are, like support cases. When we're dealing with our great dev team, what cases are they working on? What are their use cases, right? And all this was in Jira. So we had no way of connecting to Jira. And what we did is we created a web data connector that now allows us to pull in this important information and build dashboards to help us every day understand what's going on. Now you'll notice that last thing on the bottom. Have you ever not given a salesperson a commission statement? It's a bad day when that happens. So you want to make sure that they can get to their commissions information pretty quick and easy. Same thing, that was sitting in Jira. So this gave us the flexibility to really communicate to managers, to support teams, to dev teams, even to the sales leadership teams as to what was going on. I also wanted to put this up here. There's a lot of other reasons we could use Web Data Connector, right? Has anyone ever wanted to connect to Quandl? We actually had a guy in our last class come up to us and say, hey guys, I use Web Data Connector. I connect to Quandl. It's been fantastic. And I can refresh that financial data, right? So I want to let you guys know that I am a couch potato. It's okay. Again, we're among family, friends. Anybody else a couch potato in here? Yeah. After you eat that big dinner, you sit back, watch a little TV, right? I'm not a big reality show kind of person because I think it's all kind of scripted anyway. But I do love TV drama and TV comedy where I can laugh. And my favorite one, yes, I'm a big nerd, is The Big Bang Theory. I love Sheldon. I got claps for that one. That's awesome. But you know what's so sad? Bazinga. It actually got bazinga. I love it. There's a reason you said up front, Tanya. So one of the bad things is that they moved my favorite show from Tuesday to Thursday. Anybody see that? So Tuesday nights, we're home by 6. All the things are done, cheer and all that great stuff. Thursday is softball night, and we don't get home until 8. So I always miss it, and I don't get to see it till Friday. Exactly right. I don't get to watch it till Friday. So instead of getting my Big Bang Theory time, I have to wait till Friday instead of Tuesday. So I thought, well, if they're going to move my favorite show, how does that rank with other good television shows? And maybe there's something on Tuesday night or other nights that I may watch that may be just as entertaining. Don't know for sure. So I was actually looking for a database to help me out with this. And the first thing I looked at was was there a database out there that would have that information? Probably not, because there's not really a ratings database out there that I could connect to, right? I looked to see if I maybe had a file export option. Yeah, but as new shows come online, I might want to refresh this and kind of look at it periodically and just see if there's new things coming out, right? Because they come out with new stuff all the time. And then I thought, you know, we got this great web data connector. What if there was a web data source out there that I could pick up that would allow me to see that information? And so I called my friend Brendan, actually sent him an email 2 o'clock in the morning. He responded right away at 9. And he goes, you know what, Shirley, I think this is a great opportunity for us to work together. But first, where do we get the data? Where do we find that? So we did some research on the web and came up with this cool little TV movie database. Y'all seen that out there on the web? Kind of neat. Kind of rates everything out there. And you know, anything from movies to television shows, you know, so on and so forth. And really all I cared about was TV, right? And so I'm going to kind of show you what we came up with, right? As I said, after I got my email at 9 in the morning from my buddy Brendan, he went straight to work to put something together for me. And so what he did is he sent me this great URL here. You'll see this down at the bottom. So here's my URL, right? Localhost, blah, 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 which is kind of cool. And he said, put this in the web data connector and go have some fun. I said, great. So I selected that. There we go. I'll get it in a minute. And I got this cool little splash screen. Now, what's really cool about the Web Data Connector is you can actually decide in a huge, large amount of data which data pieces you want to bring across, right? Because there's databases have a lot of stuff that maybe is not relevant to what you want. And so I only wanted a couple of things. And then you could create these cool splash screens that, to go do something. And this is the most difficult part of the whole journey. Obviously, Brendan had the worst. Sorry, Brendan. But all I had to do was just say get data. And what it allowed me to do is it's actually connected to that web service and pulled down for me things like popularity and names and years. One of the cool things, have you ever seen a TV show and went, is this a rerun? Is this a new show, right? And you want to see when did this actually first air, right? Because this could be a 1960s show, right, and you fell in love with. They're making all those new shows now where they dress like 70s and 60s now, so you don't know if that's a new show, if I'm looking, what that really is. And so what I created was this. I love visualizations. I love to play around with them. I love to see what I can do with it. And so the top up here is some filters, things I could sort from strings, right? So I could pick out comedies and dramas and things like that. And then the other one shows the ratings of the TV shows and then where they're coming from. You know what I found was really interesting about this data set is that we actually watch television in the U.S. for things that are built in other countries, right? Like Japan and China and Great Britain and other areas. And so this was a U.S.-based TV rating database. And there's all these other countries in there, which I thought was fascinating. And then over here is a little cute picture poster. I liked it a lot, so I use it. And then this is the timeline of when those occurred, right? And so one of the first things I noticed here as I'm looking at my data, and we'll go ahead and look at everything at this point, was that this was the best rated show, highest rated show of all the data I had in my database. Which, by the way, this database has 55 years of data, okay? So lots of data here. And so Westworld, kind of a weird-looking picture, got my interest peaked. So I'm like, what in the world is that? So I went and started looking at some things. Looked at the album that comes with Westworld, right? You know the guy that did the Game of Thrones is the same guy that did the soundtrack for this as well, which is kind of cool. He had others on the list, which was pretty awesome. But I didn't know what it was. And I read the description of it. It looked really weird. So believe it or not, I'm sitting in my hotel room this week, flipping the channels, get to HBO, that was starting, because it had that picture on there. I'm like, oh, this is going to be interesting. So I watched it once. Okay, that was enough. All right. It was not my Big Bang Theory. So Big Bang Theory is still number one in my eyes. And so I wanted to just see real quick Big Bang Theory here. So I used a highlight filter, and notice that my Big Bang Theory is number 7. Well, that shouldn't justify a Thursday show, right? So I'm still upset about that one, by the way. But some of the other things that I noticed on here, again, looking at different countries and where and what they have actually produced. And one of the ones that really struck me kind of cool was this Doctor Who. And so Doctor Who actually won multiple television Academy Awards back in 1963. And it was one of the most popular shows. It was a Great Britain show shown in the U.S. But because it was so popular in 1963, we actually reinvented that in 2005 with a new show. So this was 1963, and this was 2005. It's the only where in history that I found that we took a television show and reproduced it as the same show. We know we do spin-offs, right? But this was actually still called Doctor Who with the same back history as what was produced in 1963. So if you watch something called The Who, it could be a 1963 show or a 2005, which was kind of cool. So there's a lot more analysis in here that I was playing with and kind of just think it was really cool, kind of the areas where they came from. Top Gear. Has anyone ever seen Top Gear? All right. This is my nephew's favorite show in the whole wide world, right? Are they making, oh my goodness. Yeah, he's going to be the first one in line. So funny story, and I'm going to turn it over to Brendan. My nephew made straight A's, got a great scholarship, UNT, great smart kid. And his father said, what do you want? If you make straight A's in school all the way through, what do you want? What is the big trip you want to do? He went to the Formula One race in Austin. So that was kind of cool. So that's the end of mine. Thank you, guys. I'm going to turn it over to Brendan. He's actually going to show you how he built this, kind of give you some good insights on that, and then get some Q&A.
Sorry about that feedback. Thank you, Shirley. I do not have the visualization skills that Shirley has, but they did bring me here to write some code on stage, so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to switch back over to the slide deck before we get there, though. All right, so we've talked a lot about what is a web data connector, where does it fit in the Tableau ecosystem, and Shirley had a great demo about using a web data connector that I wrote. But now we're going to kind of go a little bit deeper and talk about what is a web data connector at a technical level. So the analogy I like to use for talking about web data connectors is that the web data connector forms a bridge between Tableau and your cloud data. So that could be a cloud application that you're trying to connect to, like Twitter, or very commonly, it's an internal REST API that your IT team has set up. The web data connector just sits between Tableau and that data source, and it allows Tableau to ask questions of the web data connector. So Tableau might say, hey, what data do you want to bring back? Give me some of that data. What does that data look like? And the web data connector will answer those questions. At a technical level, though, all a web data connector is it's just a web page. So you saw kind of the browser experience in Tableau. We went to a URL, and that was the web data connector. That's all it is at a simple level, just a web page. It can be as simple or as complex as you can make any other web page. So we're going to see a simple HTML JavaScript example, but you could use a more complicated web framework if you wanted to. The web's kind of a crazy place. There's a lot going on. So this platform is extremely powerful, and you can do a lot with it. Before we dive in and actually start writing some code, there's a few high-level concepts I want to cover. The first is what we call the WDC phase model. So you'll notice when we went into Tableau, connected to a web data connector, it looked like we were navigating to a web page. So Tableau is going to be loading your connector as a web page inside Tableau. And when it's doing that, it can either be in one of two phases. So the first phase is what's called the interactive phase. When you first connect to the connector and you're in that web browser, the WDC is running in what's called the interactive phase. And the whole goal of this phase is to gather input from the users. So in our example, we just have a button. There's not much going on there. But your web data connector can actually be very flexible. You have complete control over that UI. So you can use it to gather information from your users. For example, maybe we wanted to have a date range filter on our TV data. So we only wanted to see data from the last 10 years or something like that. Another really common thing to get here is authentication. A lot of the more valuable web data sources you might want to connect to will have some form of authentication. This one we're dealing with today, no authentication, just to keep it simple. But you'll often run up to that in your use cases. The second phase is what's called the gather data phase. And so after we've gone through the interactive phase and that window has closed, Tableau actually loads your connector again a second time. This time, though, it's invisible, so the user doesn't see it, but it's actually still loading that same web page. When this happens, we're running in what's called the gather data phase. And the purpose of this phase is twofold. First, your connector in this phase has to tell Tableau about the schema of your data. So in the TV example, you saw we had all these columns here. There was popularity, name, origin year. That's the schema of the table you're bringing back. So it has the name of the column, the data type, and some additional metadata if you so choose. After your connector has told Tableau about the schema, the next thing it has to do in this phase is just give the data back to Tableau. So two jobs of the gather data phase. OK, that's a high-level concept. We can now get started. But to do that, you need two things. So when you begin development on your connectors, you're going to need two different things. The first is the Web Data Connector API. This comes in the form of a JavaScript script, and you'll include that in your HTML page through a script tag. We have this hosted on connectors.tableau.com, but you can also just download that and use a local version if you so choose. By the way, all this setup stuff, it's all on our documentation site, so you don't need to remember any of it. You will have kind of a nice walkthrough there for you later. The second thing you'll need in order to do development is the Web Data Connector SDK. So SDK stands for Software Development Kit. And this is available on GitHub, and it's open sourced. So this is kind of the starting place you'll want to go to when you begin development. The SDK contains a lot of useful things. The first thing it contains is a bunch of sample code. So we've written a ton of nice samples that will kind of help you get up and running and do various different things. The second thing the SDK contains is what's called the Web Data Connector Simulator. Have any of you seen this, used it before? So When you're building a web data connector, it can be often difficult if you are trying to build that in Tableau directly. The reason being is it's very hard to debug your code running inside Tableau. So what we've done is we've provided this simple web app called the WDC Simulator. And its whole goal is to mirror the Tableau environment, but allow you to debug your code on the fly. So what will happen here is you'll load your connector in the simulator, and you'll be able to set breakpoints in your standard development tools that you might be running in Chrome or Firefox. So it's a very natural experience you might be used to when you're doing web development. And we'll see a lot about this in the live walkthrough. The last thing the SDK contains is a local node web server. This is not super important, but it's worth calling out. We do have a limitation, not a limitation, but a restriction in Tableau where you cannot connect directly to a web data connector file if it's on your local file system for security purposes. So we ensure that you have to be running your connectors on a web server. So this isn't super important, and it's all talked about in the walkthrough, but I just wanted to call it out there. All right, so now we're going to get started looking at some code. OK. Over to my screen. The first thing I want to call out is this is the documentation site for the web data connector. You can go to tabsoft.co/WDC to get here, and we'll have those links at the end. But on this page, there's a lot of really helpful things. So there's a bunch of documentation. There's this getting started section that will walk you through some of the setup stuff that you'll need to do. And then more interestingly, there is a great tutorial. It's going to take you step by step through each of the things we're going to go through today. So I highly encourage you to check it out. And then the last thing I wanted to call out here is we have this community connector zone. So a lot of people have written awesome connectors, and they wanted to send it back to the community as a contribution. So there's probably about 50 connectors in here. You can use these connectors in Tableau if you want to connect to that data. But you can also come in here and check out the source code of those connectors. So this is super helpful. Gives you a lot of good sample code. OK, so in order to get started, one of the things I mentioned we needed is the SDK. So you can find this on GitHub. You can clone it with Git if you so choose, or you can just download it as a zip file. I already have it on my machine because I did not want to download that over conference Wi-Fi in front of you all. Did not sound fun. So here we are. The Web Data Connector folder is right here, and I want to show you what's inside this SDK. So the first thing you'll notice is there's an examples folder. I'm going to dive into that in a little bit more detail. And there's a simulator folder. So those are kind of the only two important things in here that you need to worry about. The rest is some extra stuff that we use for development. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start up the local node server that I mentioned. This is required in order for us to run some examples. Once I've done that, I can come in here to the simulator folder, and we can actually start diving into some examples. You'll notice there's this recent drop down, so we can choose from some of the sample code in the SDK. I'm going to choose this first example right here. So this is the simulator. I want to walk through a little bit what this looks like just so you can understand it. Like I said, this mirrors Tableau. So instead of choosing a list of connections, Excel, server, Hadoop, you actually just, this is just like we're already starting in the web data connector connection type. So if I click Start Interactive Phase, that mirrors us going to a URL in Tableau. And you'll notice that this web data connector is running inside this pop-up window. So this is the interactive phase. Again, its purpose is to gather input from the user. If I click this button, we're actually ending the interactive phase and moving into the gather data phase. So like I mentioned earlier, in the gather data phase, we're doing two things. The first is we're getting the schema. And this has already happened. So our web data connector has sent back information about the schema to the simulator. And then the second thing that happens in this phase is we actually get the data from our web data source. So the connector has gone and fetched a bunch of data about earthquakes, and we have that here in this nice HTML table. OK, so that's the simulator. Now we're going to actually start building the TV connector that we saw demoed earlier. A little bit of a slimmed down version because that one grabbed a lot of information, but basic same connector. So in order to do that, I have some starter code. I have a basic HTML page set up, so I don't have to write markup in front of you. So I'm going to copy these these starter codes into the same examples folder where the rest of the examples are. And I want to show you what's in each of these files. So this is my examples folder. Sounds like I need to refresh this. Sorry about that. My apologies. I went to the wrong folder. All right. This is our example folder, and we've just copied a bunch of sample code into here. There's a PNG. It's going to go straight into our web page. Not super important. Some CSS for basic styling. And then here's this HTML page. There's not too much going on here that's important. It's a lot of markup for how our web page is going to look. But there are a few things I wanted to call out. The first is the Web Data Connector API that I mentioned. So this comes in through a script tag, and it's going to have all the APIs, all the objects and functions that you're going to need in order to build a connector. The second thing in here that's important is this tv.js file. This is our starter JavaScript file, and that's where the bulk of our work is going to go. So all of the implementation we're going to do here in a sec is going to go into this JavaScript file. And I want to show you what's in this file to begin with. As I mentioned, Web Data Connector, it's just a web page. You can do whatever you want that you can do on the web in a Web Data Connector. But you do have to adhere to a basic interface for the Web Data Connector. And the interface is actually pretty simple. So this is some skeleton code, and you're going to see this in every single connector you work with. And all of the interface is for the connector is basically just 4 lines. So the first thing you do is you create a connector object using this Tableau.makeConnector function. So the Tableau object is something that comes in through that API tag, through the API script that we just included. And it has a function called makeConnector, which is going to create a connector object. This connector object is just kind of the starting place where we'll go and define some functions on. So this is kind of the start of every connector. And the end of every connector as a bookend is what's called the Tableau.register connector call. All this does is it says, hey, Tableau, here's my connector. I want you to know about me so you can ask me some questions. And then in the middle here is actually where most of our work is going to go. So these 2 functions are functions we define on our connector, and they do kind of what they say they do. So one is responsible for getting the schema of your table, and the other is responsible for getting the data from your data source. So both of these functions are going to run in that gather data phase, and this is where we'll spend most of our time. All right, so now that you've seen the starter code, I'm going to come in here and show it running in the simulator. Right now, it's not going to do too much because we've just filled out this HTML page. We haven't added any important JavaScript yet. But there's our connector so far. Super pretty, I know. Designed it myself. Nothing's going to happen when I click this button because we haven't filled out any of that JavaScript yet. But we're now set up to do so. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give some functionality to that button. When a Web Data Connector is first launched in the interactive phase, we're going to go in and maybe gather input from a user. But at some point, we need to signal to Tableau that we're ready to move from the interactive phase to the gather data phase. So that's the purpose of that button there. It's just going to say, hey, Tableau, I've gotten all the information I need from the user. Let's move to the gather data phase. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some on-click functionality to that button. And inside that on-click function, I'm going to call this function called Tableau.submit. And all that does is it just says, hey, Tableau, let's move on to the gather data phase. If you haven't done much with JavaScript, this might look a little funky, but there's not too much going on here. We're just saying every time this button is clicked, do something. I'm further wrapping that in a document.ready function. And all this does is it ensures that every time our web page is loaded, this code is going to execute. So I'm going to take this and copy it into our connector. I'm going to fix the indentation because that would drive me insane if it was off. And then I'm going to come back to our web page and see what happens. So refresh that, load the connector in the interactive phase. Now when I click Get Data, something happens. So what's happened is we've moved from the interactive phase into the gather data phase. You'll notice now that the web page seems like it's hung. That's because it's sitting there waiting for the connector to do something else, and we haven't built that yet. OK, so now our connector is in the gather data phase, and the first thing that happens in that phase is we're going to get the schema information of our table. So basically, we need to go and fill out this function. I've worked with a lot of developers on the Web Data Connector platform, and I've actually seen that this can be one of the most tricky parts. Just figuring out exactly how your API works, what is the information that is available through the REST API you're trying to connect to, that can often be really challenging, especially when the REST API doesn't give you great documentation. For this, I would recommend a tool called Postman. If you've heard of that one, it's awesome. If you haven't, I encourage you to check it out. It allows you to kind of interactively explore different APIs. Luckily, the TV API that we're connecting to has some really good documentation, so we're going to go there and check it out. We're going to connect to the exact same endpoint that Shirley connected to in her demo, and that's going to give us information about popular TV shows, or top-rated TV shows. So this is a documentation. It's a basic Git endpoint. So if you come down here, you're going to see some information about what query parameters are available to send to this REST API. And then what we're really interested in is what is the response from that API. So in the get schema function, what we're doing is we're getting information about our schema, and we're passing it to Tableau. So we first need to know what's available. This website has a nice example of a response, and you'll see this in most REST APIs, hopefully. And it shows us that this is the information that's available from that endpoint. You'll see in here, there's popularity, name, origin country. So this is all the available information that we can include in our schema. So for simplicity, I'm just going to grab two fields from this API, the popularity and the name. And I'm going to construct this columns array here. And so inside the columns array there's going to be an object for every single column in our schema. When you're building your schema for a web data connector, for every column you bring back, there are two things that are required. A unique ID for that column, and then also the data type of that column. So the data types we support are strings, ints, booleans, dates, date times, and floats. So I'm going to take this, and I'm going to copy it into our get schema function. We're just defining our columns. But the next thing we need to do is actually create a table out of these columns. So Tableau communicates in tables. Web Data Connector can actually support multiple tables. We're just doing one here for simplicity. But the next thing we need to do is actually go and create a table object. So what I'm doing here is we're wrapping that column information inside of another JavaScript object. And this JavaScript object is going to represent our table. The columns property is required for this table, and so is the ID property. I've added an alias here, which is optional, that gives the table a user-friendly name. All right, so now that we have our table object, the last thing we need to do is just send that information back to Tableau. The way we do this is through this passed-in function. If you haven't done much with JavaScript, this might look a little weird, but this is a very common mechanism in JavaScript. What's happening here is that parameter that's passed in, schema callback, is actually a function. And that function is passed by Tableau to our connector. So Tableau gives us this function, and our connector uses this function to send information back to Tableau. So the syntax for that is here. We're basically just calling this function, and we're passing this function our table. We're actually passing an array of tables because we could pass more than one if we wanted to. All right. So that's it. That's it for our get schema function. We're going to see this working now in the simulator. Started the interactive phase. Getting the data, tableau.submit was called behind the scenes. And now when I come down here, I'm going to see that I actually have schema information. So that's working successfully. If I were to try and progress any further, this application would hang because we haven't filled out the rest of our connector. So the very last thing we need to do is actually go and get information that matches that schema. So that's going to be the get data call. So let's go and fill that out right now. All right. So this is going to be the guts of our get data call. And what's happening here is we need to send a request to the REST API endpoint and get information back. The way we're going to do that is by using an AJAX request through a library called jQuery, a very common JavaScript library, super helpful. I would highly encourage you to check it out. And so all that's going on here is we're saying, hey, I'm going to send a request to a specific URL. That's going to be the REST API endpoint we're trying to hit. The data I'm trying to get back, I expect it to be JSON. And then once we get that information successfully, I want to do something with it. So for now, let's just log that information to the console so we can make sure we're getting it correctly. All right, so that's going to be in our get data call. Before we try this out, we need to actually specify what the endpoint is that we're trying to hit. So I have the connection URL defined here. Again, it's the API for the movie database, and we're trying to hit the TV resource and get popular TV shows. So this is the URL of our endpoint. I'm going to come in here and place this right here. All right. So now that we have this request, we should be able to go hit the REST API and get information back. And we should see it logged to the console here. So let's try that out. Okay, interactive phase is run. We've got our schema. And finally, we'll be able to get some information. Fortunately, we ran into a problem. While it would be nice if we never hit bugs, I can almost guarantee that there will be some bugs when you start developing your web data connectors. I know I hit them frequently. So luckily, the simulator has told us there's an error, and now we just got to figure out what that error is. This is kind of the entire reason we provide the simulator to you, is so that you can use your development tools you're used to inside Chrome or Firefox and figure out exactly what went wrong. So you'll notice here I have this error about unauthorized. So something's wrong with the authentication for my request. We didn't provide any. That's probably the problem. But the nice thing here is I can actually go into my source code and set breakpoints so I can kind of explore some of these objects more in depth. So if I come back here and try and run the getData function again, I'll actually hit this error breakpoint. And I can see thrown error, unauthorized. I can actually see the request that came back and all the information inside it. If I come down here, I can see response text. Status is invalid API key. OK, so we didn't provide an API key with a request. That was the problem. Luckily, I have one prepared. So we're going to insert that into our connector right now. I'm going to put that up top here just so it's accessible anywhere. And finally, what I'm doing here is I'm updating our connection URL so it includes that API key in the request. So if I come down here, I'm going to replace this line. And there we have it.
Where'd you get the key?
So this is a pretty common mechanism. That's a great question. I went to the movie database, and I signed up as a developer, and they provided me with a key. So the goal is, they don't want just anyone abusing their website. I could write a script that just, ping their website over and over again. They want some way to identify you, though, so if you're abusing their system, they can shut you down. So. And some do charge money. Yes. Good APIs are very valuable, so it makes sense. Let's say, OK. Sorry, now we're going to try this out. And what we should see happen is we should actually get information logged to the console now. I'm going to open up my debug tools. And I'm going to look at the console, start the interactive phase, run getData. And now we actually have some information that we got back from this API. So it sent us back a JSON object. Inside that JSON object is a results array. Inside that results array is another object for every single resource it sent back. So we have 20 TV shows here with names, popularity, et cetera. So this is awesome. We got information from our endpoint successfully. The very last thing we need to do is just send this information back to Tableau. So that's what we're going to do now. So in some cases, you can just send that information you got back directly to Tableau without changing it all. But often, you're going to want to do a little bit of data cleanup. In our example, we don't want all the information that came back. We want to just have 2 fields. And sometimes you actually need to do a little bit of ETL if you want to clean up the data source a bit. So what I'm doing here is I'm just iterating through that results array that we saw earlier in the console. And I'm making a new JavaScript object that just contains the 2 fields I'm interested in. I'm then storing them in another array so that I can use that value later. This is not specific to the WDC API. This is just some JavaScript to clean up the code I got back, or the information I got back. So we're putting this in a success function because we want this to run as soon as we get information back. There we go. OK, so now what's happening is we get our information back from the REST API. And as soon as we do that, we're going to basically just go through that information, clean it up, and just keep the information we care about. And that's going to be stored in this array here. And so the very last step is just to send that array back to Tableau. And I'm going to pull this snippet into our code, and then I'm going to explain it because it makes more sense in context. So if you remember, back in the get schema call, we were passed in this schema callback as a parameter from Tableau. Similar thing is going on here. Tableau is going to give us these 2 parameters here. The first is a table. And this table object represents the table that we defined earlier in our get schema call. And the second thing it gives us is a done callback. So what's going to happen here is as soon as we get our information from our REST API endpoint, we're going to send that information back to Tableau via the append rows function. So all this is doing is saying, hey, sorry, this crashed. All it's doing is saying, hey, here's the information I got for this table. Take it. The nice thing is you can call this function as many times as you want. Perhaps you want to do some pagination with your REST API. We don't care how much information you send back through that call. It can be however much you like. As soon as you're done giving Tableau information, you just call the done callback. And that just signals to Tableau, hey, I've gotten everything I want. You're ready to finish up, get the user into their analysis. And now let's check this out in the simulator. Run the interactive phase, got my schema. And finally, now we actually have some data back. So this is a complete working web data connector. We're done with all the code we need. We've gotten information about some popular TV shows. We see that Walking Dead's pretty darn popular. And the last thing I want to show you is just this running in Tableau. So if we come here, connect to the web data connector. The URL you enter is the same URL you were entering in the simulator. This is going to be 888. It's going to be my examples folder. And I'm going to go directly to this tv.html page. Yeah.
It saved your last one. Can you save them,
The recently used list, I think, saves up to 5. And it's not something you can configure. It's just going to say, what are the last 5 things I connected to? So finish the interactive phase. The get schema call is already executed because I have my information here. And then finally, when I click this button, the get data function is going to run, and we're going to pull information back from the website. All right, so that is it for our demo. We've built a complete connector from scratch and got some information from a REST API endpoint. OK, so before we finish, I have a couple more slides. There are a few things I want to just mention. I've been working with developers on this platform for over a year now, and there's a few things I consistently see trip people up, so I wanted to call those out. The first thing is the browser that you use to test your code in the simulator is not the same browser that we use inside Tableau. When you're developing a connector, you're probably using 2016 Chrome or Firefox. Inside Tableau, we use a different browser, and it's around a 2014 browser, so it's a little bit older. And the ramifications of this is it will not have the exact same support that a modern browser is going to have. We're missing, that browser is missing some of the latest ES6 features like promises, that you can polyfill those if you want to. So the reason I tell you this is make sure you test your connector in Tableau to make sure it's working, and don't just rely on the simulator. They're different environments, so they're going to be a little bit different. We do have another session later today that talks about how to debug your code inside Tableau. So if that's something you're struggling with, come to that. The next thing I want to mention is interactive phase, gather data phase. They run in completely separate web browser instances. So what this means is that you can't have shared state between those two instances. So for example, if I had stored a date filter in my interactive phase, I couldn't store that as a global variable and then use that later in the gather data phase. We have a separate property on the Tableau object that is intended to do just that. So that's the Tableau.connection data property. It's all in our docs. I just want to call it out so you're aware. The last thing I want to mention is that refreshing WDCs on Tableau server doesn't work right off the bat. You cannot publish a web data connector data source and have it refresh immediately. The reason for this is we don't want your server admin to be able to run arbitrary JavaScript code without your Tableau server admin's permission. So we ask that the server admin, as a security measure, vet the web data connector code before it can run. OK, some resources for you. We have 2 awesome command line utility tools that are available through pip and npm. If you don't know what those are, come chat with me. I'm happy to talk about them. But that will allow you to get some information on all of the DevTrack resources for the content. And I'll leave this slide up at the end. We have a Tableau developer portal available at developers.tableau.com. This is kind of the landing page for all of our extensibility points. So it's going to have links to all the docs. It has a nice community forum where you can chat with other people. There's our GitHub page. We have a lot of open source projects. And finally, we have a sweet YouTube channel, because videos are great. And then finally, a few related sessions. Later today, there's a talk on advanced web data connector topics. We're going to cover some advanced UI features. We're going to talk about authentication, including OAuth authentication. And we're going to talk a lot about debugging your connectors in Tableau. So that might be useful to you. And then another one is wrangling cloud data, which is a session about how Tableau engineers have built web data connectors to use internally at Tableau. And so it's just kind of a walkthrough of their experiences and the challenges that they faced. Please give some feedback on the session. We want to make it even more awesome next year. So we highly value your feedback. And that is it. I want to open this up for Q&A, and I'm going to leave this resources slide up here, even though it's kind of grayed out. Sorry about that. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate your time. Any questions? Yeah.
So I'm at Cisco, and our networking team is beginning to shut down network folders where lots and lots and lots of our business teams store Excel documents to load into their dashboards.
OK.
So they're being moved to store their Excel files in box.com or Dropbox or things like that. I was thinking I would build a web data connector that would connect to those web sources, allow people to pull in that Excel data.
Mm-hmm.
But based on what you talked about, having to define the schema of the data ahead of time, there's going to be 1,000 different Excel files. Have you seen that done as a web data connector?
Yes. One of the first web data connector examples we had was connecting to Google Sheets before we released native integration. So it's definitely possible. It's just going to be a little bit more work. You'll have to kind of read the schema dynamically and then use that to make your get schema call. So the schemas do not have to be defined in advance. That was just a simple example. You can define those dynamically. I'd also love to chat with you afterward about Box and Dropbox integration because it's something we're working on. So yeah, right here.
Hey, if you had a dashboard and use the Java API and you use like the select marks, can you fire off a dynamic a query? It seems like this is kind of static.
So the question is about the JavaScript API?
Well, no. I mean, if you had a dashboard and you had a bunch of marks on it and you select one, can you then make a web call?
Oh, OK.
Grab data just for that mark. We have databases that have billions of rows in them. I can't pull the whole thing back with an extract.
Yes. The question is, within a dashboard, can you use the web data connector to basically dynamically fetch data based on a mark selection? The answer, unfortunately, is not right now, though it's a request I've heard and I really want to get to. So thank you for that feedback. Yeah. I think it's OK. He said they use R for that, and that seems to work. Right here. The question is, when would you use the extract API versus the web data connector? I would say there's a few different things going on there. The first is if you want to have some sort of custom UI where your users can just access that, grab some filters, and you want that to be in the hands of users, the web data connector is a great resource for that. The other thing to keep in mind there is the extract API can be great for batch processing if you have a ton of information you want to get sorted around in the back end and then get published. The web data connector is going to be going all through the client side. So if you have an extract that takes 10 hours to create, it might be a frustrating experience for users if they're trying to go through the web data connector.
Any other questions?
Right back there.
Sorry, just a quick question. Is there any plans to publish very trusted API sources, or I'm sure there's some out there from Google land, but I'm just curious if you guys have sort of helped out and put some lists together for your
The question is there a list we've put together about what APIs might be good to connect to, or
trusted sources out there that we can collect for various categories, because we do a lot of health data, so
Sure.
it'd be nice to get some big data, health data APIs that we can trust, that legit, or data.gov, a lot.
So the question is, does Tableau have any sort of guidance or any sort of trusted list of API providers that we could provide? The answer is no, and while I think that would be really awesome, and we can definitely offer guidance, I think logistically we wouldn't be able to publish such a list because there's hundreds of thousands of sources out there. But we do have some guidance on how do you test and vet web data connectors, and so we could include something in that about how to make sure APIs are legit. So.
Give me examples that you've been using. They're all open HTTP sources.
Yeah.
Do you have any examples where you've actually gone through HTTPS with authentication, etc.?
The question is, do we have any examples where we're dealing with authentication, going through HTTPS? The answer is yes, we have some. So we have some examples about doing basic authentication. We also have some examples about doing OAuth. So those are probably the most common examples I see. In the advanced session, we're going to actually talk about that for about 15 minutes. I'm giving that talk with the dev lead on my team, and he goes into great depth on that subject. There's a lot of other authentication schemes out there, and we don't have examples for all of them. So if you have a specific one in mind.
Are they
The OAuth example is on the GitHub. The basic auth example is not yet on our GitHub page. It's on our dev lead's public repository, but I can get you a link to that. We will move it to the basic one, or to the GitHub repository at some point.
If you have multiple sources for similar data, so take natural gas prices,
Okay.
and there are various sources that publish a weekly update on that. Would you recommend separate data connectors that each go to their own file, or can those updates be sent simultaneously to the same file?
Yes. So, I think that's really up to you how you want to architect that. There's nothing that restricts you from just using one data source with one connection. You can totally connect to multiple data sources within the same web data connector. So if it's easier to have them all in one, that's a great way to go. And also keep in mind, you can bring back as many tables as you want. We just showed one table here, but you could have 20 tables that you bring back. Anyone else? All right,
Any other questions?
Come up and chat with me afterwards. I'd be happy to talk more. And thank you so much for coming. We really do appreciate your time.
Thank you, guys.